Now, on the Georgia vote.
Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
And make no mistake, we will win.
We are days away from potentially knowing who the next president will be, and the top of both tickets are taking another swing through Georgia. We'll take a look at the themes Donald Trump and Kamala Harris hope to hammer home with potential Peach State voters.
Plus,
your freedoms and your future are on the ballot. There's a stark contrast this election cycle.
State Democratic Chair Congresswoman Nikema Williams shares how she's working to bring Vice President Harris across the finish line and into the White House.
And this morning, Spiro Amburn and Kyle Gomez-Lineweber sit down for our Politics Roundtable.
All right now on the Georgia Vote.
From the 11 Alive studios, this is the Georgia Vote with Faith Jesse and Zach Merchant.
9 days. That is all that is left between us and Election Day. And in a race that is expected to be razor close, Election Day could turn into a long night of counting results.
That's right. This past week, both of the major party nominees made sure to work in a stop or two in our critical battleground state.
Republican nominee, former President Donald Trump, made 2 stops here in Georgia Wednesday, including a rally at Gas South Arena in Duluth. The group Turning Point Action and its founder, Charlie Kirk, organized the event. A big change in messaging this year. Despite his dim view of early voting in 2020, former President Trump is now encouraging his supporters to take advantage of Georgia's early voting window.
Most importantly, just vote. Whichever way you want to do it. I've been one that says, whichever way, just get out and vote. Be a little careful. Make sure your vote gets counted. There are ways of doing that, too. With your help, 13 days from now, we're going to win Georgia. We're going to defeat Kamala Harris, and we are going to make America great again.
Also on Wednesday, Mr. Trump spoke at a faith-focused town hall at a church in Pike County, about an hour south of Atlanta. The former president made his pitch to conservative Christian voters, hoping they will support him by a wide margin here in Georgia. And he will be back in Atlanta on Monday with a rally at McCamish Pavilion on Georgia Tech's campus. That is set to start at 6 p.m.
And the next day, Vice President Kamala Harris took the reins. It was a star-studded night at a high school football stadium in Clarkston. Among the celebs taking the stage at Halford Stadium, Samuel L. Jackson, Spike Lee, Tyler Perry, and Bruce Springsteen. He performed. This event marked the first time former President Barack Obama joined the sitting VP on the campaign trail. And Harris asked Georgia voters to consider what she called the brutally serious consequences if Donald Trump wins a second term in the White House. And then she asked the audience to picture the Oval Office 3 months from now.
It's either Donald Trump in there stewing over his enemies list, or me working for you, checking off my to-do list. You have the power to make that decision. It is your power. It is your power.
And Zach, this week, both of us got a front seat to both of these events, me at the Harris rally, you at the Trump events. I will say at the Harris rally, she really emphasized those younger voters, those first-time voters, as well as Tyler Perry addressing black men directly.
And I think for me, I've covered former President Trump's rallies for years now. The thing that really stood out at his most recent campaign events is that back in 2020, you'll remember it wasn't just him. A lot of Republicans had a pretty dim view of early voting. Now that message totally changed. You hear it from the former president, as well as many of his top supporters and surrogates. They're really pushing this early voting window. And of course, you can watch the highlights from former President Trump's and Vice President Harris's events in Georgia this week. It is all on 11 Alive Plus, and it is free to download on your streaming device. Life in a swing state, of course, means lots of campaign visits, and not just from the tops of the ticket. On Saturday, Republican vice presidential nominee Senator J.D. Vance was at the Georgia Freight Depot in downtown Atlanta.
All I've got to do is go around and talk about that, not just that Donald Trump has good plans for a golden age of prosperity, but that when he was president, inflation was 1.5%. I get to go around and talk about when Donald Trump was president, take-home pay was rising faster than it had in 40 years in the United States of America. I get to go around and brag that when my running mate was president, groceries were affordable, housing was affordable, and the border was shut down and closed.
And today, second gentleman Doug Emhoff is stumping for his wife, Vice President Kamala Harris. It is all part of the final sprint into the final full week of campaigning before Election Day.
And this is also the start of the last push for early voting, which ends on Friday. So far, about a third of the state's 7.2 million active voters have either submitted an absentee ballot or voted early in person. The Secretary of State's office says the numbers continue to shatter previous early voting turnouts. There were only a few reports of voters waiting in line for more than 30 minutes. They do expect turnout to ramp up during this final week.
We have also learned of an apparent attempted cyber attack targeting the state's absentee voter website. According to the Georgia Secretary of State's office, that attack was stopped before it could do any significant damage. Gabriel Sterling, the COO of the Secretary of State's office, said the attack likely originated in Russia or China and used hundreds of thousands of bots from all across the world to try to overload parts of the Georgia election website. The attack came on October 14th, the final day of voter registration in the state. Sterling said a cybersecurity team was able to quickly shut down the attack.
The intention of a DDoS attack, which is called a distributed denial of service attack, is to basically crash your site. That is the goal at the end of the day. But we were able to act so quickly, we were able to put an interface up to basically say, hey, are you a human? The second we put that in, we saw a decline instantly.
Sterling said it took about 30 minutes to stop the attack, and there is no damage to the election website. He added that in the week and a half that has followed, no other attacks have been reported. After the break, we sit down with State Democratic Party Chair, Congresswoman Nikema Williams, hear her pitch to undecided voters, and hear her answer when asked about Vice President Kamala Harris's role in border enforcement.
And later in our Voice of the Voter segment, we take you to this Hindu Mandir in Gwinnett County to find out how one woman's life journey is now guiding her choices this election year.
In the closing days of this election, both major parties are making a final appeal to voters. On last week's edition of the Georgia Vote, we heard from the Republican State Party Chairman, Josh McCoon. Today, we sit down with State Democratic Party Chair, Congresswoman Nikema Williams.
So the stakes of this election could not be more clear. Our freedoms and our future are on the ballot, Zach. Our economic freedom, our freedom to vote, our reproductive freedoms are all on the ballot. And I know what I'm voting for, and the Georgia voters that I'm talking to every day over the course of the next 14 days are equally as concerned about all of these issues.
You mentioned reproductive rights. You mentioned the economy as some of the biggest issues. We hear that from voters who talk to us as well. If Vice President Harris becomes the next president, what's her plan to address these issues?
So Vice President Harris has been very clear. Send her a Congress that will put a bill to codify Roe v. Wade across her desk, and she will sign it into law, restoring reproductive freedom across this country, something that Donald Trump has bragged about, overturning Roe v. Wade. We've heard it firsthand here in Georgia with the tragic stories of the death of two women, Candy Miller and Amber Thurman, who had preventable deaths because they could not get the care that they needed right here in their home state of Georgia. And when it comes to their economic freedom, I've been in conversation with especially a lot of black men who are raising families in this country who have a history in this country of not being able to build generational wealth because of so many things that have been stacked against them. And Vice President Harris has a plan to make sure that we can continue to build more black businesses, investing in that initial capital, but also making sure that we can sustain those businesses long term. And also down payment assistance to buy those first-time homes, because we know that investment into home ownership builds generational wealth, and that is something that we need to do to close the racial wealth gap in this country, something that people are experiencing every day when trying to not just continue to get by, but to get ahead in this country. You mentioned the economy. I want to ask you about two other issues that we hear from voters a lot about being at the top of their priority list. That's inflation and illegal immigration. Some critics have argued that inflation has surged under Vice President Harris's role in the White House. Illegal immigration has surged during her roughly 4 years in office as well. And some critics say that she's responsible for that, since she was the sitting vice president as this happened.
What do you say to those critics?
So, I'm a member of the United States Congress. We had a bipartisan border deal on the table negotiated by conservatives in the U.S. Senate. And the deal was ready to be brought to the floor. Democrats were on board, Republicans were on board, until Donald Trump himself inserted himself into the process and said, oh no, we don't want a border deal because it might help Democrats in this election cycle. That is the sign of someone who is not serious about leading this country, because we had a deal on the table that was bipartisan, and we could have done something to make sure that our border was secure, make sure that people could come here and have a legal pathway to citizenship, something that most Americans agree on. But Donald Trump said, no, let's not get a border deal done. Let's make sure that we don't give Democrats something that could possibly help them win the election. So I blame Republicans who agreed with Donald Trump and took his advice and stepped away from a deal that they negotiated.
Does she bear any responsibility, though? She was in office. She was the border czar at the beginning of her time as vice president. Does she bear any responsibility for this?
So, Zach, I'm going to correct you on her being the border czar. That is something that other people have made up. That is not an official term, not something that was assigned by the White House.
It was part of her portfolio.
Well, her portfolio was not to be a border czar. Her portfolio was to find out a plan for people coming from South America and what was driving immigration, what was driving migrants across the border. There is no such term as border czar, but that is what has been the narrative. And
terms aside,
well, the terms matter, though, Zach. Terms matter.
She had a responsibility.
What we know is that in that responsibility, as someone who comes in to break a tie in the Senate, as the vice president does, she was ready to come in and support that bipartisan border deal that was on the table, that had been negotiated by conservative Republicans and Democrats alike, until Donald Trump inserted himself into the process. So that is who is to blame for us not having a deal on the table so that we can create a pathway to citizenship, a legal pathway to citizenship, and make sure that we are having security at our borders.
We're short on time. I want to end here with just about 60 seconds to go. We are in crunch time of this election. Election day is just a few days away.
It's Election Day today. Election Day is every day.
The final pitch from Georgia Democrats and national Democrats to a potential voter who is watching this right now is what?
Your freedoms and your future are on the ballot. There's a stark contrast this election cycle. Kamala Harris will not be a president for Democrats or Republicans. She'll be a president for all Americans. Go to iwillvote.com/Georgia and find your nearest early voting location and go and cast your vote early.
You can watch our extended interview with Congresswoman Nikema Williams right now on 11 Alive Plus. And don't forget, it is free to download on your streaming device. And up next, our Politics Roundtable with Spiro Amburn and Kyle Gomez-Lineweber. We'll discuss Georgia's role in the final 9 days before Election Day and the keys to victory for both presidential nominees. Stay with us. You are watching The Georgia Vote. Welcome back. It is time now for our political roundtable. Today we have Spiro Amburn. He is currently a senior vice president on McGuire Woods Consulting's Georgia government relations team. He's previously served as chief of staff for Georgia House Speakers John Burns and David Ralston. Also joining us, Kyle Gomez-Lineweber. He's a director of policy and advocacy for Galileo and the Galileo Impact Fund. Most recently, he served as policy committee administrator for the Georgia House Democratic Caucus. He's also worked for Gwinnett County government in policy and constituent services. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. Welcome on. Let's start here. It is crunch time. We are feeling it. I'm sure you guys are feeling it too. Just about a week to go until Election Day. I want you to each answer this. We've seen lots of visits from these candidates coming through Georgia. Kyle, we'll start with you. Do they make a difference this time of the year?
Yes, absolutely. I think, it shows Georgia voters, and I think, as a representative of Galileo, Latino voters especially, that we have power, not just to decide the election here in Georgia, but to decide the election for the entire nation. Last election we saw President Biden won our state with fewer than 12,000 votes. Here in Georgia, we're probably going to decide, or at least be one of the states to decide the next election. So I think seeing all of these folks come over shows that how special Georgia is.
And there's just so much money in these races, but the candidate's time, that still remains a limited resource, right, Spiro?
Yeah, somebody get me a doctor, because there's going to be probably going to need one down the stretch. Absolutely, I agree. Georgia is a critical state here that's going to decide the election. Those margins are going to be within a percentage point or two, and I think the visits that you see by both candidates illustrate that, and I think that this is going to come down to the last 7 days.
Let me ask you about this, and Zach mentioned this earlier in the show after when he was talking about the Trump rally, that the Trump campaign really pushing out, getting out the vote early. Right now, in both of your opinions, is this about persuasion or is it about mobilizing?
Well, I think you have to be on two tracks. You have to be persuading as many voters as you can, even though there are fewer and fewer persuadable voters as we get closer to Election Day. But you certainly have to turn out as many voters as possible. And certainly our organization, as Galileo and the Galileo Impact Fund, we are knocking on doors in all throughout the metro Atlanta area, as well as in counties that people might not typically think of, like Hall County or Whitfield County.
And Spiro, the former president, is supposed to be back here on Monday at Georgia Tech.
Right.
Is his mission to try to speak to some of those disinfected voters? You're talking about Georgia Tech, a college campus in Midtown Atlanta.
Yeah, I don't know that it's so much about the campus. I do think it's about mobilization. I know Donald Trump, from the very beginning, has told people to get out and vote early. I think one thing to look at that's going to be critical for him are those voters who did not vote for him in 2020, whether or not they show up this time and vote for him.
And of course, we have a presidential election. That's always sort of the big headline this time of year, but that's not the only race that's happening. There are lots of down ballot races, state legislative races, local races. Right now, Republicans control both the state House and the state Senate, but there are some competitive races. Kyle, what races are you watching as we head into Election Day at the state legislative level?
Well, that's an important point to make because, you know, the closer you are to the folks at home, the more impact you have on their lives. And we're looking at a number of races, particularly in the metro Atlanta area in Gwinnett and Cobb. We're looking at House District 48. We're looking at where we've got Laura Mervartian, who is an endorsed candidate of ours, who's running against Scott Hilton. We've got Senate District 48, where we have Ashwin Ramaswamy, who's running against Sean Still, who's got a kind of complicated reputation right now because of his involvement in the aftermath of the last election. We're also looking at Michelle Kang, who's running against Matt Reeves in Gwinnett County, where the diverse coalition that elected Joe Biden, and we believe will probably elect Kamala Harris, is looking for, we believe, new representation. And Michelle Kang, on the Impact Fund side, certainly is someone we have been supporting.
And Spiro, just to kind of pivot off of Zach's question, and with what you just said, one of those races, Sean Still, Ramaswamy, could be competitive, but then there's other races like in District 14 with Marjorie Taylor Greene and Sean Harris, who we'll be speaking with soon. How much of a needle does it move for them to kind of attach themselves to the top of the ticket or do their own thing?
I think the key to look at in those races, primarily in Fulton and Gwinnett County, is look at the presidential numbers and look at those state legislative races. I'm watching those House races. Right now, the Republicans have 102 seats to 78 seats for the Democrats. Republicans have controlled the General Assembly for the better part of 20 years now. They're not going to give that up very easily. Those margins have begun to shrink, but I know the leadership in both chambers is setting a priority on that. But I think look at those numbers in Fulton and Gwinnett on the state legislative races and the presidential race, and that's going to be a good barometer of where we are.
Absolutely. Well, 9 days to go. We will see. Gentlemen, thank you so much for all of your time. We hope to have you back soon. Coming up, we head to one of the most beautiful spots in Metro Atlanta and hear from this doctor about the issues which shape her decisions at the ballot box. Well, every Sunday, we work to ensure that your voice is heard. After all, you can't have the Georgia vote without Georgia voters. So today, we head to a Hindu temple in Lilburn to talk to Dr. Umanji Shukla. How long has it been here? You just look around. It is absolutely stunning, all of the architecture.
This was actually inaugurated in 2007 by our fifth spiritual successor. This mandir is, in its truest sense, what a traditional mandir in India looks like. So when I think of the word mandir, if we break the word down into two words, man, which is the mind, vir, which is stillness or peace. The definition of mandir is a place where the mind becomes still. So when we're the hustle bustle, I'm a mom of two and a physician, so every week is like a roller coaster. Yeah. And so when we come here on Sundays with my entire family, we come here together, we go inside, we engage in prayer, our minds become still. We find that peace that we've been looking for the entire week.
How has your upbringing and your faith contributed to your career as a doctor?
You know, growing up, probably around high school, I had a sense that I wanted to be a physician. And I think that probably stems back from my desire to give back to others. Throughout my high school, college years, I found my calling to be in medicine. I liked the math and sciences, but I love people. I'm an extrovert, and I like to talk to people and help people. My literal home is in Smyrna, but you know, from a figurative sense, this is what I consider a home for us.
So early voting is underway here in Georgia. Did you vote already?
Absolutely, yes. My husband and I did early voting last week with our two kids. We have two boys, and they're 2 and 5. We're not really sure how much they registered and what we were doing, but early voting was really important to us, especially in the state of Georgia, and so we were happy to get our votes in.
What was that number one issue for you politically driving you to the polls this year?
Sure. Well, as a first-generation Indian American physician and South Asian, of course, and a mother of two, there's so many key issues at stake here. I don't think I could probably particularly point one particular issue, but I think what I feel these days now is that there's a lot of division, and feel more that people are spread across the table more than ever before.
And we always like to end on this question. What are you most optimistic about this election year?
Well, I think that Georgia was unique in early voting statistics. I think we reached the highest number of early voters in the first day, which is maybe over 1 million. That's exciting.
Yeah, and she really spoke about the excitement that people were into voting, the fact that she wants the country to come together. And fun fact, if you want to visit the Mandir in Lilburn, you can sign up and go inside. Cameras were not allowed inside, so we had to stay outside.
You know what else she said? She voted early.
She voted early.
Somebody, really both campaigns are going to be happy to hear that. We don't know how she voted, but the push to early vote is on.
Absolutely.
And you still have time to do it. You also have time to watch us next week. We're finished today, but we'll be back, and we hope to see you right back here next Sunday at 11.